It's time now for Perspective, and my guest today is a filmmaker who's just released an extraordinary film set in Baghdad in the days leading up to the execution of former Iraqi President Saddam Hussein in 2006. But the film's interwoven human stories of suffering, fear and hope, set against a backdrop of intense sectarian violence, leave the viewer in no doubt that Iraq at that time was a country tearing itself apart. With me on set today is Maysoon Pachachi, director of Our River, Our Sky. Thank you so much for being with us on France 24 today.
Thank you.
When you set out to make this film, what was the main thing that you were hoping to achieve?
Well, several things. One thing is the people who live in war zones are often seen as victims. If people care about them, they're seen as victims. Actually, nobody is just a victim. And I wanted to give a sense of people, so people could relate to them. The people like us, caught up in difficult circumstances. What would I do in a situation like this? Because, you know, the troops left, the American troops, the invasion happened, and then finally the Americans left and so forth, and so everybody forgot about it, and everybody thought, oh, well, the war is over. Actually, the war is absolutely not over.
And you were speaking just a little bit earlier, you said that this was a film you felt you had to make. Is the film you've made the film you thought you were going to make at the beginning?
To some extent it is. I mean, the form of it stayed intact. It was always going to be a collective story, a lot of individual stories intersecting over a period of 7 days. So you get it's like, I've often thought of it, Iraq, as a sort of mirror that's dropped from your hand and shattered into many pieces. You've managed to preserve all the pieces and stick them back together again, but you've got the mirror in the same shape it was, but it's now fractured. It's a bit like that. This film is like that. So to the extent that that is still the form of the film, that it is a collective story like that, I have, yeah.
And at one point, one of your main protagonists, Sarah, she's a novelist, she says that she can't write anymore, that writing anything would be a lie. Did you encounter at any point that same feeling that no artistic expression could do justice to the situation in Iraq at that time?
Yes. I mean, in fact, my co-writer, Irada Jabouri, is a novelist. And this business of not being able to write, being sort of shocked into silence by the degree of violence around her and by the way that the whole society was fracturing. She was not able to write any one word of fiction because it would just be a lie. So as she was going about her daily business, taking her child to school, going to teach at the university, etc., she was overhearing scenes being acted out in, you know, at the grocery store while people were buying things or on the bus or whatever. And she would just write down as a part, just as a sort of document, just verbatim what she heard and saw. And I similarly was doing that sort of thing as well, because I had a lot of contacts. I started a film training center in Baghdad and was in contact with the students there and women's organizations and so forth. And so I had a lot of stories. And so we pulled our stories together, yes.
And your film is peppered with a lot of ghosts, people who've been kidnapped, people who've been killed, disappeared. There's much less of a focus on the perpetrators of that misery. What was behind that decision?
Well, always for me, I mean, the interest is in not in the blood on the streets or the violence or anything. It's not the events themselves, but what the events, what effects they create in people and how people deal with that. What I'm interested in really is what do you do with what happens to you? And because everybody in Iraq is carrying traumas around with them, basically. And they are managing to find a way to renew a sense of fragile hope every morning to get themselves out of bed and out the door to do whatever they need to do. That's what really interests me. So it's the perpetrators don't interest me, you know. And it's, but, I mean, or maybe that's another story. I was interested in just people going about daily lives in such a situation. Yeah.
And one of the main recurrent questions in this film is whether to stay or whether to leave. And actually, Sarah's daughter, at one point, she's one of the main proponents of staying. She has a real emotional, visceral connection with the land. Is there any answer to that question?
Well, it's an individual question in a sense, but I think that and Sarah herself decides not to, not to leave despite some very close calls that she has with sort of violence. I think it's a very difficult decision to make. I mean, some people, I have friends who have left because they felt that their children were really in danger because they're walking down the street when an explosion can happen, and that's that kind of thing. And so they made the, the difficult trip to Sweden, across Europe, et cetera, and got asylum there, and finally. But there is a kind of wrench that happens, and you do remain a stranger. You do remain a stranger, even though you take up you decide this is where I'm going to live and so forth. But the place you've left is with you.
And this is, obviously a serious, difficult film at points. There's also a fair amount of humour, gallows, dark humour. I'm thinking of one scene just after an attack. We have traumatised people on a bus. There's a moment of absolute shock and horror. And then someone starts telling jokes, essentially. And everyone on the bus starts laughing. There's a real moment of relief there. Why was that important for you? Or was it important for you, rather, to include humour in this film?
Absolutely. Because, well, first of all, during that time of extreme sectarian violence, Iraq was like a joke factory. It was a means of resistance. I think people talk about resilience, but I think that's what's happening on a daily level is a kind of resistance against the damage and the destruction and so forth. And that's often expressed in humour and music and people making babies and things like that. But the humour was very, very important to me, and it's very much part of what goes on in Iraq now and during these more difficult times. And I think there's a kind of creative resistance that goes on, and part of it is jokes.
How much of your personal story would you say you've put into this film?
Well, I wasn't there in Iraq at this time. I haven't lived a great deal of my life in Iraq because of my dad's job. He was a diplomat, and so we were all over the place. But I have a deep connection, nevertheless, despite being away from it for such a long time.
And what was it like seeing what was unfolding in Iraq from a distance?
Very traumatic, very traumatic. In the '91 Gulf War, like most of the other Iraqis in London, I was glued to my television set 24 hours a day. And in that time, you never saw one ordinary Iraqi person on the screen. You just saw, this smart firepower ostensibly falling on nobody, as far as we could tell. So it's very traumatic too. Yeah, you find some very critical part of yourself being erased from the face of the earth. It's, for me, I went into a state of shock. I forgot my name. I couldn't remember how old I was. And eventually I made a film. And that was a kind of resistance to this. And it was a kind of healing, I suppose.
And this really is an extraordinary film. I watched it just yesterday. I was extremely impressed, and I encourage you to watch it as well. Maysoon Pachachi, director of Our River, Our Sky. Thank you so much for speaking to us on France 24 today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.